John Hook's Newsmaker starts now.
Thanks for joining us on Newsmaker. Of all the media failures in the past several years, one of the biggest may be reporting on climate change. We have been told time and time again that we are in a climate crisis. Is that true? Yes, the Earth has warmed slightly in the past 150 years, but Earth has been warmer and colder in the past. How much of this is natural variability? How much is caused by human activity? The truth is, no one knows for certain. But the reporting insists that the subject is closed, debate is over, and we are heading toward Armageddon. Is that true? Roger Pielke is a former professor of environmental studies at the University of Colorado Boulder, a scientist for the National Center for Atmospheric Research. He's published several books on the subject and now oversees a popular Substack, The Honest Broker. You can also find him on Twitter. Roger Pielke joins me now on Newsmaker. Great to see you.
You too, John.
You're professor emeritus now at Boulder. Are you liberated from the academic world now and you're more able to speak your mind about climate?
Well, you know, I've never really had any trouble speaking my mind. And, you know, the honest thing is universities have gotten weird lately. And in my instance, I published a long story about my experiences at the university, but I basically didn't have the support to do the research that I wanted to do, which was published in peer-reviewed journals. I testified before Congress. It's nothing outrageous, but universities got weird, and I'm happy to be out.
The reason I've got you on, Roger, is you are seen, and your moniker is the honest broker. You call balls and strikes. You don't claim that we're not warming, that something isn't happening. But you fall a little short of saying that we're in a crisis or heading toward Armageddon. Is that the long and short of it?
Yeah, I think if you actually pay attention to what the science says, it is somewhat different than what you will find, as you said in the opening, in the media. And if you only listen to politicians on the left or the right, you're not going to get the straight scoop on what the science actually says. The phrase "the honest broker" is kind of an in-joke because honest brokering takes a community. It takes all of us communicating, arguing, debating, disagreeing in order to find out what the truth is.
Let's start there. Debate is something that is so healthy. Science depends on it. You've got to question everything and test the hypothesis over and over again. Why has that not been welcomed in the climate world?
There's been a theory, and we see it not just in climate, but in other areas also. COVID is a recent prominent example. Some people believe that if there is uncertainty, if there's disagreement, that leads to the probability that their favorite policy, whatever it happens to be, won't be implemented. And so there has been an effort to kind of control the discussion so that only favored voices are heard and the others are labeled as misinformation. The reality is, as you say, science depends on debate. Science only works with debate. But interestingly, democracy only works with debate.
No, it's
so
true.
Science and democracy really share an important characteristic, and we cut off debate and discussion at our own peril.
You have written about something you call the noble lie. How does that color the climate debate?
Yeah, that's popularized by an Australian scholar named Ainsley Kellow and in the environmental context. And the idea has been that, well, you know, it's okay to exaggerate. It's okay to maybe put your thumb on the scale in making claims about climate if it's in service of a larger good. And, you know, it's not unique to the environmental movement. We saw this with weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. The idea that if we can just convince people enough, then, you know, the ends justify the means. And so there's this idea that if your cause is righteous, then it's okay to you know, bend scientific integrity just a little bit.
Let's take a look at some of the science as we know it right now. How much has the world warmed in the last 150 years?
A little bit over 1 degree Celsius, about 1.2 degrees Celsius, according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change.
Okay, is that, when we start getting into world temperature, I mean, climates vary from region to region wildly. Is a world temperature meaningful?
So if you want to look for changes in global temperature, the atmosphere is actually not the best place to look. The atmosphere is literally like the skin on an apple. most of the heat that's accumulated because of human activities has actually gone into the oceans. And really since 2000, there's really good measurements through the Argo floats of heat accumulating in the ocean. And the answer of the scientific consensus, which I think is solid and I support it, is that yes, human activities, notably the emission of greenhouse gases, but certainly not limited to greenhouse gases, have altered our climate system. We are adding energy to that system. People can justifiably argue about some of the details and the decimal points and so on. For me, when you think about policy, I don't need to know, the second decimal point. The fact that we're altering the energy balance of the Earth, to me, it says, all right, well, all else equal, we probably would not like to do that. But then that gets us into policy and energy and so on, and things get really complicated really fast.
The climate catastrophists claim that if we warm by 3 degrees, it will doom the planet. Does that make sense to you?
So it used to be, and this is one of the untold stories of the mainstream climate science community. It used to be that projections, let's go back 20 years, get in a time machine, were that the world was going to warm 4, 5, 6 degrees Celsius by 2100. Those projections were based on very extreme scenarios of future emissions. Long story short, we're going to turn everything into coal power, which is very carbon intensive. If my colleagues from the National Center for Atmospheric Research in the 1990s, some of whom aren't with us anymore, but if they had a time machine and they fast forward to 2025 and they heard that that current policies have us on a trajectory of something like 2.5 degrees Celsius, they would be ecstatic. What has happened in the discussion is that the threshold of catastrophe has been downsized. It used to be at 5 degrees Celsius, then 4 degrees Celsius, now 2 degrees Celsius.
So the goalposts are being moved.
That's exactly right. That's exactly the same messaging, even though the underlying science, climate change is still a problem, but it's not nearly the magnitude that scientists thought it was 20 or 25 years ago.
Well, now we're going to get into one of my favorite topics that you have enlightened me about, which is RCP 8.5. This is a number that the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, uses in their modeling. This is basically, how would you say, it's kind of a model potential scenario that models potential future greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. IPCC keeps using 8.5, and most climate scientists will say that number is way too high. If you plug that into a model, what you're going to get is Armageddon. You're going to get a really dire scenario. Most people now are settling that we're somewhere maybe between 3.5 and 4.5, right?
Yeah, so I mean, this is one of the interesting aspects of climate science, that the scenarios, and climate science uses scenarios because we can't predict the future climate in kind of like we do weather forecasting, because notably the future climate depends on what we do. How much we emit, how we change the land surface, how much air pollution there is, and so on. And so climate science uses scenarios. And they say, all right, let's look at a range of possibilities. So it turns out, again, 20 years ago, the climate science community developed these scenarios called RCPs. There were 4 of them. Remarkably, they're still using them 20 years later. That in itself is a big problem. But they range from a very low level, a low amount of climate change, to this very high one, 8.5. And it turns out everyone gravitated to the very high one. It had the most extreme impacts. It was useful for research. You could see the signal of human forcing against the background of natural variability. It was great for the media. You get apocalyptic stories that you can. They come out all the time with the new papers being published. University press offices love it. Researchers love it too because they get cited. And so we had these incentives to catastrophize climate. And as we've gone forward, the community has been very slow to adjust and update the scenarios. And we could talk about this. They're about to release some new scenarios, and they might be making the same mistake they made 20 years ago.
Has the IPCC, which has been considered the gold standard, and I look at Working Group 1, which is where the science actually is, once you get into Working Group 2 and 3, and this is a little in the weeds, this becomes a very political exercise. The policymakers, the politicians, the advocates, they take control of what comes out in the summary from the IPCC, which is really hyperbolic and dire, much more dire than the science would say.
Yeah, you make a really good point. So many people have heard of the IPCC, but as you say, it's not a single thing. It does have 3 working groups, and they operate more or less independently. The working group 1 is on physical science, working group 2 on climate impacts, and working group 3 on economics. And the way I characterize it to people is working group 1 in my areas of expertise, extreme weather, scenarios, projections, they've played it pretty straight for the last 30 years. There's some hiccups along the way, but they've done a pretty good job, and my research is in there, and for the most part, they've treated it pretty fairly. Working Group 2 has been captured by climate advocates and is very much an advocacy emphasized effort. And Working Group 3 is not so much climate politics, it's more academic politics. A small group of modelers who model the what's called integrated assessment, the energy system, have been in charge of that. So each working group has its own little ecosystem. I tend to, if you're interested in climate, the physical science of climate, working group 1 is the one.
Totally agree. That's what I lean on when I look at this stuff and start looking. And when I've read it, I am amazed at how far afield that is from the summary that is contained in the final IPCC report. The sad thing is nobody reads the science.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you take all 3 working groups, it's about 10,000 pages.
Yeah, I mean, and I haven't gone through all of it, but I have looked up many, many things. Right. And it's kind of shocking when you see this and you're going, what is going on? So the question is, what is going on?
Yeah, so we have, climate change is a battle over the future of the global economy and the global energy system. And it's not surprising that it becomes very political very fast because it involves all of us in every country around the world. It involves big money. There are vast parts of planet Earth where people live that don't have access to the energy services you and I enjoy every day. And so there are different demands. If you have no access to electricity, you really don't care if it's coming from coal or nuclear or whatever. You just want the lights to come on. So there are different pressures on climate science. And this is, again, this gets back to where we started. This is why debate and discussion are really important, because we're trying to meet multiple goals. We're trying to lessen the impact that energy consumption has on the planet. I think everybody would agree with that. We want costs to be low. We want access to expand around the world. And as we're seeing lately, we want energy supply to be secure and reliable. All of those things don't always push in the same direction. And finding that sweet spot has proved pretty elusive so far.
Roger Pielke is my guest, former professor of environmental studies, professor emeritus at University of Colorado Boulder, scientist for the National Center for Atmospheric Research, published several books on the subject, oversees the popular Substack. I highly recommend it, The Honest Broker. You can also find him on Twitter. We are back with Roger Pielke in a moment. Welcome back on Newsmaker. Roger Pielke is a former professor of environmental studies at the University of Colorado Boulder, professor emeritus now, a scientist for the National Center for Atmospheric Research. He's published many books on the subject and oversees the popular Substack, The Honest Broker. Highly recommend it. You can also find him on Twitter. Back with Roger now. Okay, let's talk about the lack of debate in this subject of climate change. It's starting to happen now. There is more of it. We're seeing it more. Some of the liberation of Twitter under Elon Musk has fostered some of this. I see parallels, do you, between COVID and climate science, because if you question the accepted narrative, you became a leper, an outcast, and you were to be silenced. I think that's dangerous.
Yeah, I agree entirely. And if you just look at the issue of the origins of COVID, which still aren't 100% certain, and there hasn't been an investigation of that, in the early days of the pandemic, because President Trump and members of the Trump administration suggested a research-related incident, the natural response from some was to say, well, if Trump says it, it must be wrong. And anyone who supports that then must be on that side. And things became very polarized very quickly. The reality is, in a situation of uncertainty, there will be people who have very different positions. And bringing them together and exploring why they have those differences, how might those differences matter for going forward, that's essential to good decision making. And we seem to have lost some of that capability during COVID. And as you mentioned, I've seen it up front and backstage in the climate debate for a long time.
Yep. Let me read you something from Associated Press. This is Seth Borenstein. I'm sure you're familiar with him. This is January 25th. The headline is, Earth breaks yearly heat record and lurches past dangerous warming threshold. Earth recorded its hottest year ever in 2024 with such a big jump that the planet temporarily passed a major climate threshold. It surpassed the long-term warming limit of 1.5 degrees Celsius since the late 1800s. That was laid out in the Paris Climate Pact. This stuff starts to get kind of hyperbolic. Then you find out that Associated Press is paid $8 million a year to produce climate stories. That strikes me as pay for play. I may get pushback from some journalists on that. But AP said itself, we're going to hire 20 new environmental writers with the money to create a climate SWAT team. That doesn't sound to me like journalism. That sounds like advocacy.
Yeah, there is, and you'll know this better than me. I mean, with the changes in journalism over the last really decades, there is such a thing as the climate beat now, and there's people whose entire careers are predicated on producing stories about climate and climate change every week, a couple times a week, and to get clicks and to get eyes, it's better if those are, they have conflict, or if it bleeds, it leads sort of thing. The article that you talk about, the 1.5 degree Celsius temperature change target from the Paris Agreement, that's a political invention. It's not a hard and fast, go over a cliff sort of thing. But climate has had for a long time what's been called deadlineism. The idea that we set a deadline, and that creates tension as we approach the deadline. It gives an opportunity for stories like the one you talked about. But the reality is that climate change is an incremental process. All else equal, we'd prefer less rather than more. But it is not the sort of thing like you're driving a car real fast and the edge of the Grand Canyon is up ahead and you fly off. That's just not how it works.
I don't know that people are getting that from the coverage they're getting. They are getting all this doomerism. One of your areas of expertise is natural disasters, weather disasters. Let's just tick them off. And this is all in Working Group 1. It's right there in the IPCC. Let's go through it. What has gotten worse? What has gotten better? Let's start with the one that we think about in Arizona, fires. Have fires gotten worse?
So the IPCC actually does not assess fires directly. And the reason for that is that fires themselves are a really complicated phenomena that involve, there's a climate factor, but there's also ignition, there's also fuels, there's also management.
Arson.
Of landscape. There's, all sorts of human impacts, arson included. So what they do is they focus on what's called fire weather, and that's hot and dry. And the IPCC does say there are some indications in some places around the world that in some places, mainly because of the heating, it has become hotter and drier. That said, it has not reached the threshold of detection, and that's a technical term the IPCC uses to be able to say that, we're 90% confident that this is increased. And if you look at the projections, go to table 12.12 and chapter 12 of the IPCC, you'll see that they don't expect to have that detection by 2050 or 2100.
There you go. Okay. Droughts.
So droughts. So the IPCC actually has 3 or 4 types of drought. Hydrological drought, which is has to do with water. Meteorological drought, which has to do with rainfall, and soil moisture deficits. Either if it's on land we manage, it's agricultural drought, or if it's natural lands, it's ecological drought. They have not detected trends in hydrological or meteorological drought, and there is some indication, some strong indication, that there are soil moisture deficits that have grown around the world.
Okay, but that's not what we're getting in the reporting. Okay, what about hurricanes? Are hurricanes getting worse?
Yeah, so hurricanes are what we call them in the North Atlantic and off the Eastern Pacific.
Or typhoons.
They're tropical
South
cyclones.
of the equator.
Yep.
Yeah.
Typhoons. Yep. And the answer is the IPCC has not detected an increase in
Okay,
hurricanes
again,
or
we are
tropical cyclones.
told the opposite.
Yeah, since 1900, and this is something I published on extensively, as you know, the U.S. has not seen an increase. Now, let me say, one of the most remarkable features about hurricanes in the United States was the 11-year period from 2006 to 2017, when the United States was not hit by a major hurricane. That's Category 3 or stronger. That's unprecedented in the record. And so I get it. If you came of age sometime in the 21st century, you could think, based on your lived experience, well, we didn't used to have hurricanes, and now we have a whole bunch. But if you go back to the 40s and the 30s and the 20s, and you look at the data, what was remarkable was that long drought of hurricanes, not the fact that we have them now.
Roger, we have spent globally trillions upon trillions of dollars to try to lower CO2 emissions. And we have not. So far, the world has not even managed to start reducing global carbon emissions, which last year hit a new record. We're spending all this money and we're not moving the needle. What's the problem?
So the issue is, and let me say, a lot of the money is spent, but it's not really spent on climate change per se. There's not a big pile of money that's being burned. There are a lot of inefficiencies out there, but let me say, there's good news out there also. We've entered what's been called a long plateau in emissions. Yes, they're still creeping up, but certainly not at the rate they were in the early
And U.S.
2000s.
has declined, right? We are declining on CO2 emissions.
The U.S. has declined. The number one reason for the decline in U.S. Carbon dioxide emissions since 2005 is fracking technology that has led to a dramatic expansion in the consumption of natural gas. Natural gas is about half as carbon intensive as coal. Coal has been on its way out for a long time, for several decades, and nothing the Trump administration is even the very kind words about coal aren't going to resuscitate that. And also, we've become much more efficient in how the economy is run. Renewables, solar and wind have their place. Where they work well. Arizona is a particularly wonderful place for solar. As we've seen recently in Spain and Portugal, you got to take care of the grid also.
No doubt.
Overall, nuclear power is having a renaissance around the world. So I'm actually pretty optimistic that smart, pragmatic, common sense energy policies will bend that curve of emissions, even if emissions aren't front and center in our mind.
We've got about 30 seconds in the Newsmaker program. We're going to continue this on our YouTube channel and on our Fox 10 Phoenix platforms. But let me conclude with this, Roger. Are you hopeful that we're going to start having sober discussions about this, pro and con on what we should do, that the days of silencing people who question this, and by the way, it seems like it's all academics like yourself who are retired or emeritus, then they're free to speak their mind. But until then, they are captive of the university system, and if you don't toe the line, you're not going to get funding and you're not going to be very popular.
Yeah, I'm very optimistic, and I can't say I'm a fan of the sledgehammer approach the Trump administration is taking to universities, but I do. I'm a creature of universities almost my whole life, and I know that university leaders across the country realize that there are problems now. Maybe the pendulum has swung too far the other direction, but hopefully out of all this emerges a more sober, a more pragmatic view as to what we're supposed to be doing in universities, because things definitely got a little weird there for a while.
Roger Pielke, you can find him on Substack, The Honest Broker. You can also find him on Twitter. Plenty of books he's written. Roger, thank you. We're going to continue the discussion on fox10phoenix.com, on YouTube. So we'll see you there. And Roger, thank you for your time. We're back in a moment on Newsmaker. Thanks to Roger Pielke. Really enjoyed it. Learned a lot. Hope you did too. We'll see you next week on Newsmaker. For those of you continuing our conversation with Roger Pielke, he's a former professor of environmental studies, University of Boulder, scientist for the National Center for Atmospheric Research. He's published several books on climate and other things. You can find him on Substack, The Honest Broker. Highly recommend. You can also find him on Twitter. Roger, thank you for continuing the conversation.
Yeah,
as CO2 levels have gone up, CO2, by the way, is not poison. I mean, we breathe it out as human beings. It is essential for plant growth. My understanding is, correct me if I'm wrong, and they're seeing this from space, the Earth, as carbon CO2 emissions have gone up, the Earth is getting greener and maybe healthier. Is that true?
Yeah, well, the Earth has certainly gotten greener because carbon dioxide, as you note, is plant food, and so more carbon dioxide, all else equal, leads to greater plant growth. Whether that's healthier or not, I mean, that's something that's a value judgment, and people will debate that. But the point you raise is a good one. That when we alter the climate, it's not all negative and doom and gloom. There are aspects of change that are beneficial. I mean, for example, people in high latitude, Siberia, Canada, are probably going to see future climates that are more amenable to certain types of agriculture. And so that's part of the mix and the complexity of change.
It seems that we've gotten hysterical, or some have, over 1.1 degrees Celsius of warming since the 1800s. Was 1850 a great period to be around living in the climate, or was it less hospitable?
Yeah, so I wrote a piece about, it was titled "When the Climate Was Perfect," because the idea of climate policy is return us to the global temperatures of the 1850 to 1900 period. If you take a look, and I took a deep dive into the 1870s, the 1870s were a remarkable decade in terms of climate. It's incredibly extreme. In particular, the 1877-1878 El Nino event was one of the strongest ever in human history, for sure. And it contributed to the deaths of 4% of the globe's population at the time, mainly due to drought and famine in places like India, sub-Saharan Africa, and elsewhere. But people don't realize that climate is highly variable, and there have been periods that are way more extreme than what we've experienced recently.
So, Roger, with that in mind, how certain can we be of what the CO2 emission factor is in what's happening with warming? In other words, do we know for certain that our CO2 human-produced emissions is causing this change, or could some of this just be natural variability?
So you take that at different levels. So the fact that the Earth is accumulating heat, particularly in the oceans, as we discussed, is as the IPCC says, virtually certain. There's no doubt about that. Now, when you get down to the level of the occurrence of specific weather phenomena, and people, generally focus on extremes, but there's other aspects of weather that matter for farmers and agriculture and so on. It becomes a lot more difficult to identify the signature of carbon dioxide on those phenomena. So it is warmer, and it's been warmer in a lot of places. And you talk to farmers in the agricultural industry, they've actually experienced those effects. At the same time, yield growth has continued to increase in agriculture, and that's expected to continue. So the challenge isn't to have certainty about what are the effects of carbon dioxide, but to make sure that we have the technologies and the processes in place so that we're ready to be flexible and adapt to whatever the combination of human-caused climate change and natural variability want to throw at us going forward. I can tell you there are going to be periods like the 1870s or the 1970s or the 1930s with the Dust Bowl in our future and in our lifetimes. Can we predict those with any certainty? No, absolutely not. So I'm a big fan of robust policymaking that makes us really ready for anything that comes down the road.
Why does no one want to talk about the medieval warming period? This is getting in the weeds, but you can explain what it is, what it was, and why the people who are pushing hard on climate alarm don't want to discuss the medieval warming period.
Yeah, I mean, there is a debate, and at this point, 2025, I do view it very much as a sideshow. That everything that happens that's negative with respect to climate can be attributed to humans. And as part of making that argument, it would be really convenient if historical natural variability were really small. And so what you refer to as the medieval warm period refers to a period, century ago when temperatures were warmer. That's the general scientific consensus.
Warmer than now.
Warmer as warm as now. I mean, again, this is debated.
This is pre-CO2 emissions.
Right. Yeah. And so the issue for me isn't so much, how warm is it? How's it compared to the past? For me, the issue, I make it a lot simpler. We're affecting the energy balance of the Earth system. So if there's common sense, smart policies we can put in place that reduce that impact we're having, then by all means, let's implement them. Figuring out what those are is not easy. That's why we need policy researchers who are thinking about how to square the circle of energy access, energy cost, energy reliability, and energy impact. So for me, climate science gets us to the front door. It gets us to the point where we say, oh, okay, are there some smart policies we might want to put in place? Doesn't tell us we have to act, doesn't tell us what we would have to do, but it does say, hey, pay attention. We're tinkering with this wonderful, complicated Earth system.
Yep. Let's talk about that for a minute, because the net zero push, it appears it's losing steam. Let me read you a quote from Tony Blair, former Prime Minister, Labor Prime Minister. He said he has called for a major rethink of net zero policies, arguing that limited energy consumption and fossil fuel production is doomed to fail. He said voters feel they are being asked to make financial sacrifices and changes in lifestyle when they know the impact on global emissions is minimal.
Yeah, so net zero is this idea that to eliminate the impact of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we have to get to the point where we're not emitting any, or we're capturing those emissions. That's the net in net zero. And Tony Blair is exactly right. People are not going to sacrifice their livelihoods, their incomes, their lifestyles, just for the goal of net zero. And so for me, that's a boundary condition on policy design. It is true in many places and among many advocates, there is this idea that we get to net zero by reducing human energy consumption. There is a branch of academia these days that is focused on what's called degrowth, the idea that we want to shrink the global economy. That's not going to go anywhere. You're never going to see a politician get voted into office promising to make people poorer or shrink the economy. We call those recessions and depressions. So the reality is, if we are to succeed in reducing carbon dioxide emissions and the human impact on the planet, we're going to do it at the exact same time we oversee a massive expansion of the global economy. It's not so much you or me that are going to contribute to that expanding economy. It's the 5 billion people who don't enjoy the energy access and services that we do.
And with population growth in the decline, those seem to be disparate ideas, frankly.
Yeah. And I mean, let me just say on that point, I would, the peaking of population earlier than predicted is going to be a massive problem around the world.
No doubt.
It's also going to contribute to less carbon dioxide emissions. So we're going to have to figure out a lot of things beyond just climate change as we go into the 21st century.
One of the things that's lost in this debate, and you mentioned it earlier, developing countries, they don't have the luxury of net zero fantasies.
Right.
They have got, as Steve Koonin puts it, the wolf is at the door. They need the lights on. I mean, they can't run a refrigerator. This is cruel. It's not right. And to impose these kinds of Western ideas on countries in Africa that are trying to just get their foot in the door to get a leg up and have a life and a standard of living and live a long life. You can't saddle them with this stuff. It seems terribly cruel to me.
Yeah, one of my friends and colleagues, Todd Moss, who runs the Energy for Growth Hub in Washington, D.C., he wrote a piece about World Bank celebrating emissions reductions in Burkina Faso, where the average person uses less energy than your or my refrigerator over a year, much less, in fact. The U.S. and Europe in particular have pushed African nations not to develop using fossil fuels, which is to condemn millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people to continued energy poverty. So it's not the only thing that matters. Carbon dioxide is not the only thing that matters. There are other aspects where we want to consume energy. So, as I said, if your only source of energy is a coal-fired power plant, you're going to say, plug it in, I'll take it.
Yep.
And that's part of the reason why the discourse on climate change sometimes misses really important elements in the global economy.
So this is Steve Koonen's point of view. Koonen, he was in the Obama administration. He was Undersecretary of Energy. So he was very on board all of this. And then when he dove into the science, he got kind of rattled by saying, we're not as certain about this as we thought we were.
Right.
But his point about this is that, there are things we have to focus on, and energy abundance is critical to life, to longevity, and that you have to produce it, and you cannot deny this to developing countries. It's not right.
Yeah, I know Steve, and he's a good guy, and he's absolutely right on this point. I have my students in my classes over the last few years when I was at Colorado, and one of the things they would ask me, I talk about climate change, we talk about a lot of things we've talked about, and they would ask me, what's the deal with nuclear power? Why why
I'm glad you brought this up. I'm glad you brought this up.
Yeah, why are my parents so afraid of it? And because they say, it sounds like it's the perfect technology if you care about climate change, and they're right. It is safe. It produces a massive amount of electricity, and it's carbon free, and we know how to deal with it. There are the experiences of 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, Fukushima,
Nagasaki, Hiroshima.
Right. People associate nuclear power with nuclear weapons, nuclear bombs. But what I tell people is, it's perfectly legitimate to have concerns about climate change, and it's perfectly legitimate to be fearful of nuclear power. But if you have both of those views, then you have a math problem, because I cannot make the mathematics of emissions reductions work without using nuclear power. It's a big stick, and so it's also very secure for countries. They don't have to import liquefied natural gas. They don't have to depend on coal. If you're China, you import coal from Australia. Nuclear power has a lot of benefits. It's not perfect. Every energy technology has pluses and minuses. But that's one reason why I'm optimistic about decarbonization, is that I do think we're going to see a dramatic expansion of nuclear power around the world.
A couple more things before we wrap it up.
Yep.
You've talked a lot about natural disasters, and we always hear the reporting that it's the worst ever. It's caused the most damage, billions. We've never seen a number like this. We see this in California. We saw it in Florida. There's a reason that the number is going up. And I don't believe it's because of climate change. I believe it's because of people who've moved into harm's way.
Well, it's that's the exposure part, but the reality is not only are there more people, but there's more structures with more stuff inside of them, and we're a vastly richer country and a vastly richer world than we used to be. So understanding climate through the lens of economic damage is a recipe for confusion. One of the things I do in my research is we seek to what's called normalize disaster losses, to put it into the context of societies that were much smaller with fewer people and much poorer. And if you actually take a look, say, at global disaster losses in terms of global GDP, it's flat or declined slightly over the last 30 or 40 years. So actually, we're doing pretty good on disasters. There's a good news story there that is rarely, if ever, discussed.
And finally, Roger, during this period of warming, we've never been more prosperous. We've never been better educated. We've never been healthier. So show me the crisis.
Yeah, so this is one where it's climate advocates have to be careful, because if they say, oh, the 1.5 degree Celsius temperature threshold has been breached, and most people look around and they'll say, well, it's not much different than it was yesterday, and I'm doing much better than my parents and my parents' parents. That's not the measure. Climate change is always going to be a risk problem. It's not going to be an apocalypse problem. So what it means is that we're creating risks that we, all else equal, we probably wouldn't want to create. And so it's not an incipient crisis. It's not an existential threat, but it's the sort of things that we would like to manage. And so this is, and if you want to try to sell climate change based on the apocalypse, when people come and say, well, we should be pragmatic and take common sense steps, they don't like that. But that's really how this issue is going to be dealt with. And it's why I'm optimistic, because I think people around the world recognize the importance of energy abundance, that energy economics, we can't pay too much for energy. We need cheap, secure, reliable energy. And I think as more people get that message, climate policies are going to be much more grounded. And my hope, and maybe this is a fantasy, that 10 years from now, we're talking about a large bipartisan consensus on smart energy policy. That includes climate change, but it's not centered on climate change. And
you think that's possible?
I think there's a good chance. It's not possible in 2025, but
okay.
Energy is too important to let it forever be as politicized as it is today.
I really appreciate it. It is great to see you. I'm not going to say go Buffs because we're opponents now.
Right.
But continued success with Substack, The Honest Broker, and I just appreciate so much your sober look at an issue that, again, as I said at the top, I think is really often misreported.
Well, thanks, John. I appreciate the opportunity to share these views and get it out to more and more people.
Okay. Roger Pielke, thank you. We appreciate you tuning in, and we'll see you next time. Roger, thank you.